What would you do if the person you loved most in the world vanished without a trace? What if every lead went cold, every theory crumbled, and the one person who might hold the key to the truth was just a child, too young to understand the horror he witnessed? This is the story of Bonnie Hyam, a 23-year-old newlywed who disappeared on a cold January night in 1993. For 3 years, her family lived with unanswered questions, false hopes, and a growing certainty that something terrible had happened. The police had their suspicions, but no evidence, no body, no case. Then, in 1996, a 5-year-old boy pointed to a spot in his grandparents' backyard and said 5 words that would shatter a family and solve a mystery. That's where Daddy put Mommy. What they found buried there would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. But the story doesn't end with the discovery. It begins there, unraveling a web of deception, betrayal, and a mother's desperate attempt to protect her child that ultimately cost her everything. December 25th, 1992. Jacksonville, Florida. The camera is shaky, the quality grainy, but the joy in the room is unmistakable. Michael Hyam had just bought his first video camera, and he was determined to capture every moment of what he believed would be a perfect Christmas. "Say hi to the camera, Bonnie." Michael's voice calls out from behind the lens. Bonnie Hyam turns toward the camera, her blonde hair catching the light from the Christmas tree. At 23, she is the kind of smile that lights up a room. Warm, genuine, infectious. She's holding their 2-year-old son, Aaron, who is more interested in the wrapping paper scattered around the living room than the camera pointing at him. "Hi, camera," Bonnie says with a laugh, bouncing Aaron on her hip. Aaron, wave to Daddy. The little boy looks up at his mother with adoring eyes before shyly burying his face in her shoulder. Bonnie's laugh is pure music, the sound of a woman who, despite everything, still finds joy in the simple moments. But if you watch that video carefully, really carefully, you'll notice something. Just for a split second, when Michael's voice becomes a little too commanding, a little too controlling, Bonnie's smile falters. Her eyes dart toward the camera, toward Michael, with something that looks almost like fear. It's easy to miss. The moment lasts less than a second before her smile returns, bright and beautiful as ever. But it's there, captured forever on grainy home video. The first glimpse of the cracks in what appear to be a perfect marriage. Bonnie and Michael had been married for less than 2 years. They'd met in high school, started dating young, and seemed like the ideal couple to everyone who knew them. Michael was charming, successful, and devoted to his family. Bonnie was vibrant, loving, and completely devoted to their son. Their house on Dolphin Avenue was modest but well-maintained. Bonnie had decorated it with care. Family photos covered the mantelpiece. Aaron's toys were neatly organized in the living room, and fresh flowers always sat on the kitchen table. It was the kind of home that should have been filled with laughter and love. But homes, like marriages, can hide secrets. Bonnie's friends at the insurance office where she worked as a claims adjuster had begun to notice changes in her over the past few months. She'd become quieter, more withdrawn. She'd started wearing long sleeves, even on the hottest Florida days. When pressed about bruises on her arms, she'd laugh them off. Clumsy, she'd say, always walking into doors. Her best friend, Linda Morrison, had grown increasingly concerned. Bonnie wasn't herself. Linda would later tell investigators. She was always so bubbly, so full of life. But in the months before she disappeared, it was like watching someone slowly fade away. The signs were there, hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. The way Michael would show up unexpectedly at Bonnie's workplace. The way he monitored her phone calls. The way her friends noticed she'd stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans beyond the next day. But Bonnie was trying to protect something more precious than her own safety. Every decision she made, every risk she calculated, revolved around one person, Aaron. Her beautiful, innocent little boy who deserved better than the life he was inheriting. On that Christmas morning in 1992, as Michael's camera captured what would be their last holiday together, Bonnie was already planning her escape. She just didn't know she was running out of time. January 6th, 1993. The morning started like any other. Bonnie dropped Aaron off at daycare, kissed him goodbye with an extra long hug that the daycare worker would remember months later, and headed to work at the insurance office. She was scheduled for a full day, several client meetings, paperwork to catch up on, the usual routine that had become her lifeline to normalcy. But Bonnie never made it to her first meeting. At 9:15 a.m., her supervisor, Margaret Williams, called Bonnie's house. No answer. She tried again at 9:30, then 10 o'clock. By 10:30, Margaret was worried. Bonnie had never missed work without calling. Never. It just wasn't like her. Margaret would later tell police. Bonnie was the most reliable person I knew. If she was going to be 5 minutes late, she'd call. For her to not show up at all, I knew something was wrong. Margaret called Bonnie's mother, Elaine Clifton. Elaine hadn't heard from her daughter since the night before. She immediately drove to the house on Dolphin Avenue, her heart pounding with a mother's intuition that something terrible had happened. When she arrived, Michael's car was in the driveway, but Bonnie's was nowhere to be seen. She knocked on the door, then used her key when no one answered. The house was eerily quiet. She found Michael in the bedroom, still in his pajamas at 11 a.m., claiming he had overslept. When she asked where Bonnie was, his answer made her blood run cold. "Oh, we had a fight last night," Michael said casually, as if discussing the weather. She got upset and left. Said she needed some space to think. Elaine stared at her son-in-law in disbelief. "Left? What do you mean left? Where's Aaron?" "He's at daycare. Bonnie dropped him off this morning before she left." The story made no sense. Bonnie would never, ever leave Aaron. Not for an hour, let alone indefinitely. And if she had dropped Aaron at daycare that morning, why hadn't she gone to work? Elaine demanded answers, but Michael's story kept changing. First, he said Bonnie left after their argument. Then he said she left early in the morning. Then he claimed she had taken money from their savings account because she was planning to start over somewhere new. By 2 p.m., Elena called the police. Detective Ray Futch arrived at the Hyam house that afternoon to find a family in crisis. Elaine and Bonnie's father, John Clifton, were frantic with worry. Michael seemed oddly calm for a man whose wife had just disappeared. "Tell me about this argument," Detective Futch said to Michael. Michael's version of events was detailed but cold, delivered with the kind of detachment that immediately raised red flags for the experienced detective. According to Michael, he and Bonnie had been having marital problems for months. She was unhappy, he said. She felt trapped by motherhood and marriage. The night before, their argument had escalated. She said she couldn't do this anymore, Michael told the detective. She said she needed to find herself, that she wasn't ready to be a wife and mother. She packed some clothes and left around midnight. Said she might go to her sister's place in Tampa, or maybe further away. Detective Futch took notes, but something felt wrong about the whole story. He'd worked dozens of missing persons cases, and this one didn't fit the typical pattern of a woman leaving her family. The details were too convenient, too neat. "Did she take any money?" Futch asked. "Yeah, she cleaned out her savings account. About $3,000. "What about her car?" "She took that too." But when Detective Futch spoke to Bonnie's family and friends, a completely different picture emerged. Linda Morrison, Bonnie's best friend, was adamant that Bonnie would never abandon Aaron. She was planning to leave Michael, Linda told the detective, but she was going to take Aaron with her. She'd been saving money, talking to lawyers about custody. She was scared of Michael, but she would never, ever leave her son. Linda revealed something else that made Detective Futch's blood run cold. On January 5th, the day before Bonnie disappeared, Linda had received a terrifying phone call from her friend. "Bonnie called me around 8 p.m., Linda recalled, her voice shaking. She was whispering, like she didn't want someone to hear her. She said, "Linda, if anything happens to me, you need to know, Michael has been threatening me. He said if I ever try to leave him and take Aaron, he'd kill me first." Linda had begged Bonnie to come to her house that night, to bring Aaron and stay until they could figure out what to do. But Bonnie was too scared to make any sudden moves. She said she had to be careful, that she had a plan. She was going to wait until Michael went to work the next day, then pack up Aaron and disappear. She had it all figured out, but Bonnie never got the chance to execute her plan. Instead, she vanished into the night, leaving behind a 2-year-old son who kept asking for his mommy, and a family desperate for answers that seemed impossible to find. Detective Futch knew in his gut that Michael Hyam was lying, but knowing and proving were two different things entirely. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, All he had were suspicions and a story that didn't add up. The investigation was just beginning, but already, Futch feared they might be too late. January 8th, 1993. 2 days after Bonnie disappeared. Detective Ray Futch's radio crackled alive just after 7 a.m. We found the car. Bonnie's 1987 Honda Civic had been located in the parking lot of the Motel 6 near Jacksonville International Airport. The discovery sent a jolt of hope through the Clifton family. Maybe Bonnie really had left on her own. Maybe she was safe somewhere, planning her next move. But Detective Futch felt no such relief. As he stood in the motel parking lot, staring at Bonnie's car in the early morning light, every instinct told him this discovery raised more questions than it answered. The car was locked, keys nowhere to be found. When they finally gained entry, what they found inside made Futch's worst fears seem more likely. Bonnie's purse was in the trunk, not the passenger seat where a woman might casually place it, but hidden in the trunk like someone wanted it found later. Her driver's license, credit cards, and keys were still inside. But the $3,000 that Michael claimed Bonnie had taken from her savings account? Gone. What woman planning to start a new life leaves her ID behind, but takes only cash? Futch muttered to his partner, Detective Mike Williams. It made no sense. The motel manager, a tired-looking man named Carl Peterson, was no help. He hadn't seen anyone matching Bonnie's description, hadn't noticed when the car appeared in his lot. The parking lot wasn't monitored by security cameras. This was 1993, and such luxuries were rare for budget motels. But Peterson did tell them something interesting. On the morning of January 7th, the day after Bonnie disappeared, he'd noticed a man walking through the parking lot, looking at cars. Medium height, dark hair, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The description could have fit thousands of men in Jacksonville, including Michael Higham. When confronted with the car's discovery, Michael's reaction was telling. He didn't seem surprised or particularly concerned. Instead, he nodded knowingly, as if this development confirmed his story. See, he told Detective Futch, I told you she was planning to leave. She probably took a cab to the airport from there. The police checked with every airline, every car rental company, every bus and train service. No one matching Bonnie's description had purchased a ticket or rented a vehicle. If she had left Jacksonville, she'd done it in a way that left no trace, which, given that her ID was still in the car, seemed impossible. The investigation began to focus more intensively on Michael Higham. Detectives conducted multiple interviews, each one revealing new inconsistencies in his story. First, he said he'd gone to bed immediately after Bonnie left. Then he claimed he'd stayed up worrying about her. When pressed about the specific timing of their argument, his timeline kept shifting. The breakthrough seemed to come when Detective Futch convinced Michael to take a polygraph test. If Michael was lying, the test would reveal it, and they'd finally have grounds for a more aggressive investigation. But Michael passed. The polygraph results were clean, no signs of deception, no indication that he was lying about the events of that night. For the investigators, it was devastating. They'd been so certain Michael was responsible for his wife's disappearance. But the polygraph suggested otherwise. Maybe we were wrong, Detective Williams suggested during a late-night strategy session. Maybe she really did leave on her own. But Futch couldn't let it go. He'd worked enough cases to know that polygraph tests weren't infallible. Some people could pass them while lying, especially if they were skilled manipulators or had convinced themselves their version of events was true. The investigation continued, but with less intensity. Weeks turned into months, and the leads dried up. Bonnie's case was still active, but resources were limited, and newer cases demanded attention. The family never stopped believing that something terrible had happened. Elaine Clifton visited the police station weekly, begging for updates, bringing new photos of Bonnie, refusing to let her daughter become just another statistic. She didn't leave. Elaine would tell anyone who would listen. My daughter didn't abandon her son. Someone hurt her, and they're getting away with it. Aaron, now 3 years old, continued to live with Michael. The custody battle Bonnie's family wanted to wage seemed impossible without proof of wrongdoing. Legally, Michael was still Bonnie's husband and Aaron's father. He had every right to raise his son, despite the family's suspicions. But children see things differently than adults. They notice details that grown-ups miss, remember conversations that adults forget. And Aaron, innocent and trusting, had begun to ask questions that made everyone uncomfortable. When is Mommy coming home? He would ask his grandmother during visits. Where did Mommy go? He would ask his father at bedtime. And sometimes, playing in the backyard of his grandparents' house, Aaron would stop what he was doing and stare at a particular spot near the back fence. When asked what he was looking at, he would shrug and return to his toys. But his grandfather, John Clifton, noticed that Aaron always avoided playing in that exact spot. It was as if the little boy instinctively knew something was wrong there, even if he couldn't articulate what. By 1996, 3 years after Bonnie's disappearance, the case had gone cold. Detective Futch had retired, passing Bonnie's file to younger investigators who had never met the vibrant young woman whose smile could light up a room. Aaron was now 5 years old enough to form clear memories, old enough to understand more about the world around him. He still lived with his father, still visited his maternal grandparents every weekend, still asked about his mother, who had simply vanished from his life. What no one realized was that Aaron's young mind held the key to solving a mystery that had stumped experienced detectives for 3 years. And that key was about to be revealed in the most innocent, heartbreaking way. May 15th, 1996. A warm Saturday afternoon in Jacksonville. 5-year-old Aaron Hyam was playing in his grandparents' backyard, the same yard where he'd spent countless weekends over the past 3 years. John and Elaine Clifton had converted their garage into a playroom for their grandson, determined to give him as much normalcy and love as possible in the wake of his mother's disappearance. Aaron was chasing a ball across the grass when it rolled toward the back corner of the yard, near the old oak tree that provided shade during the scorching Florida summers. As he ran to retrieve it, he suddenly stopped, staring down at the ground beneath his feet. Elaine, who had been watching from the kitchen window, noticed Aaron's stillness. Something about his posture, the way his small shoulders tensed, the way he seemed frozen in place, made her abandon the dishes and hurry outside. "Aaron, honey, what's wrong?" The little boy looked up at his grandmother with eyes that seemed far too serious for his age. Then, in a voice so matter-of-fact it made Elaine's blood run cold, he said, "That's where Daddy put Mommy." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Elaine felt her knees nearly buckle as the full implications of what Aaron had just said crashed over her like a wave. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Aaron pointed down at the spot where he was standing, a patch of earth that looked no different from anywhere else in the yard. "Mommy, Daddy put her here." Elaine's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She knelt down beside her grandson, trying to keep her voice calm and gentle despite the panic rising in her throat. "Aaron, can you tell Grandma more about that? About Daddy and Mommy?" The story that came out of Aaron's mouth, told in the simple, direct way that only a child can manage, would become the key to solving a 3-year-old mystery. But it would also reveal a horror that no child should ever have to witness. Mommy and Daddy were fighting. Aaron began, his 5-year-old voice recounting memories from when he was barely 2. Mommy was crying. Then there was a loud noise. Really loud. It scared me. Elaine's hands were shaking as she reached for Aaron, pulling him into her arms. "What happened next, honey?" Daddy picked up Mommy. But Mommy wasn't moving. She was sleeping, but not regular sleeping. Different sleeping. The clinical detachment in Aaron's voice was heartbreaking. He was describing the most traumatic event imaginable with the emotional distance of someone far too young to understand what he'd witnessed. Daddy carried Mommy outside. It was dark. I followed them, but Daddy didn't see me. He put Mommy in the ground. Right there. Aaron pointed again to the same spot. Then he put dirt on top of her. Elaine's world tilted on its axis. For 3 years, she'd suspected Michael had hurt her daughter. For 3 years, she'd lived with the agony of not knowing what had happened to Bonnie. And now, her own grandson, an innocent little boy who'd been carrying this terrible secret for half his young life, was telling her that his mother's body was buried in the place where he'd been playing for years. John Clifton found his wife and grandson on the back porch 20 minutes later. Elaine was rocking Aaron gently, both of them crying. Aaron because he'd made Grandma sad. Elaine because she finally knew the truth she'd been desperately seeking. "Call the police," Elaine whispered to her husband. "Call them right now." Within an hour, Detective Maria Santos and her partner, Detective Rick Thompson, were standing in the Cliftons' backyard. Santos was the lead investigator who had inherited Bonnie's cold case, filed 6 months earlier. She'd reviewed every interview, every piece of evidence, every dead-end lead. hoping to find something the original investigators had missed. She never expected the breakthrough to come from a 5-year-old boy. "Aaron," Detective Santos said gently, crouching down to the child's eye level. "Can you show me exactly where you saw your daddy put your mommy?" Without hesitation, Aaron walked to the same spot he'd identified earlier. He stood there, his small sneakers on the ground that might contain his mother's remains, and pointed down. "Here," he said with heartbreaking certainty. "Daddy put mommy here." Detective Santos looked at her partner, then at John and Elaine Clifton. She'd worked dozens of homicide cases, but this one felt different. The idea that this little boy had been carrying such a devastating secret, that he'd been playing in his grandparents' yard directly above his mother's grave, was almost too horrible to comprehend. "We'll need to bring in ground-penetrating radar," Santos told the grandparents. "If Aaron is right, we'll find evidence. But I need you to prepare yourselves. This investigation is about to become very real, very quickly." That evening, as forensic specialists began setting up their equipment in the Cliftons' backyard, Aaron ate dinner as if nothing unusual was happening. To him, he'd simply answered his grandmother's questions about his mommy. He had no idea that his words had just cracked open a case that had stumped investigators for 3 years. But as he played with his toys after dinner, Aaron looked out the window at the men and women digging in his grandparents' yard and asked a question that broke everyone's heart. Are they going to wake mommy up now? May 16th, 1996, 6:47 a.m. The ground-penetrating radar had been running for 3 hours when technician Sarah Mitchell called Detective Santos over to look at her screen. The readings showed a clear anomaly approximately 4 feet below the surface, exactly where Aaron had pointed the day before. "There's definitely something down there," Mitchell said, her voice tight with professional restraint. "The density readings suggest organic material, and the size and shape are consistent with what you're looking for." By 8 a.m., a full forensic excavation team was on site. The Cliftons' quiet suburban backyard had been transformed into a crime scene, complete with evidence tents, photography equipment, and a growing crowd of investigators who'd worked the Bonnie Hyam case over the past 3 years. Detective Ray Futch, now retired, had driven down from his home 2 hours away when he heard about the discovery. The case that had haunted the final years of his career was finally about to be solved. "I knew that son of a bitch was lying," Futch muttered to Santos as they watched the excavation begin. 3 years I knew it, but I couldn't prove it. The digging was painstakingly slow. Every shovelful of earth had to be carefully examined, photographed, and cataloged. At 2:15 p.m., after more than 6 hours of careful excavation, forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Chun made the discovery everyone was expecting but dreading. "I've got remains," she called out, her voice carrying across the silent yard. What they found was both heartbreaking and damning. Bonnie's skeletal remains were wrapped in what appeared to be a bedsheet and clothing. Even after 3 years in the ground, the forensic team could see evidence that this was no accidental death. Dr. Chin's initial examination revealed a bullet hole in the skull, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The trajectory suggested the shot had been fired from close range, possibly while Bonnie was kneeling or sitting. But the most compelling piece of evidence came from the soil around the remains. Mixed in with the dirt were fragments of a shotgun shell casing, partially preserved despite its time underground. "This is our smoking gun," Detective Santos told her partner as she carefully bagged the casing for forensic analysis. "If we can match this to a weapon, we've got our killer." The forensic investigation continued through the night. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, photographed, and prepared for analysis. Bonnie's remains were carefully transported to the medical examiner's office, where Dr. Patricia Williams would conduct a full autopsy. While the forensic team worked, Detective Santos was building her case against Michael Hyam. She'd already obtained a search warrant for his house, and within hours of the discovery, investigators were combing through every room, looking for evidence that connected him to his wife's murder. They found in the garage, hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, was a gun safe that Michael had never mentioned to police during their initial investigation. Inside, they found several hunting rifles and handguns, but one weapon was conspicuously missing, a 12-gauge shotgun that neighbors remembered seeing Michael clean in his driveway. "He got rid of the murder weapon," Detective Thompson observed, "but he kept the ammunition." Indeed, Boxes of 12-gauge shotgun shells were still in the safe, and preliminary comparison suggested they matched the casing found with Bonnie's remains. The net was closing around Michael Hyam, but he wasn't going quietly. May 17, 1996. 6 a.m. Michael Hyam was arrested at his construction job site, surrounded by co-workers who watched in shock as their colleague was handcuffed and read his rights. For 3 years, Michael had maintained his innocence, insisting that Bonnie had left voluntarily. Now, faced with physical evidence of her murder, his story would have to change. But Michael wasn't ready to confess. Even with his wife's body discovered in his in-law's backyard, even with forensic evidence linking him to the crime, he continued to claim his innocence. "I don't know how she got there," he told investigators during his initial interrogation. "Maybe someone else killed her and put her there to frame me." The theory was absurd, but Michael stuck to it. His lawyer, a veteran criminal defense attorney named Robert Harrison, advised his client to remain silent. But Michael couldn't seem to help himself. He wanted to explain, to justify, to convince everyone that he wasn't the monster they believed him to be. The autopsy results, delivered by Dr. Williams 3 days later, made Michael's denials even more hollow. Bonnie had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, fired at close range with a 12-gauge shotgun. The trajectory of the bullet suggested she'd been kneeling when she was killed, possibly pleading for her life. More disturbing were the additional injuries Dr. Williams found. Bonnie had suffered multiple fractures to her ribs and facial bones, injuries that had healed over time. The pattern suggested ongoing domestic violence, a campaign of abuse that had escalated to murder. This woman lived in fear, Dr. Williams told the investigators. These injuries tell a story of systematic abuse leading up to her death. The forensic evidence against Michael was overwhelming, but the prosecution knew their strongest witness would be the most heartbreaking. Aaron Hyam, now 6 years old, who would have to testify against his own father. Child psychologist Dr. Linda Rodriguez was brought in to evaluate Aaron's mental state and determine whether he was competent to testify. Her assessment revealed a bright, articulate child who had been traumatized by witnessing his mother's murder, but was capable of telling the truth about what he'd seen. Aaron's memories are consistent and detailed, Dr. Rodriguez reported to the prosecution team. He clearly witnessed the events he describes, and he understands the difference between truth and fantasy. But preparing Aaron to testify would be one of the most difficult challenges the prosecution had ever faced. How do you ask a 6-year-old to describe watching his father kill his mother? How do you help a child process memories that would traumatize an adult? The trial of Michael Hyam was scheduled for October 1996. The prosecution was confident they had a strong case, but they knew the defense would argue that Aaron's memories couldn't be trusted, that a child who was barely 2 at the time couldn't possibly remember such traumatic events with accuracy. The battle for justice for Bonnie Hyam was about to begin, and her son, the little boy she died trying to protect, would be the key witness in determining whether her killer would pay for his crimes. October 14, 1996. The trial of Michael Hyam began in a packed Duval County courtroom. Prosecutor Janet Morrison outlined the case, forensic proof of murder, the shotgun casing, the pattern of abuse, and Michael's lies from the beginning. But the prosecution's most powerful evidence would come from the most unlikely source. "You will hear testimony from Aaron Hyam," Morrison told the jury. He was only 2 when he witnessed his father kill his mother. For 3 years, he carried that secret. But Aaron's memory is clear, and his testimony will leave no doubt about what happened. The first week focused on forensic evidence. Dr. Chen testified about discovering the remains. Dr. Williams explained the cause of death and old injuries suggesting abuse. Ballistics experts connected the shotgun casing to ammunition in Michael's possession. Bonnie's friend Linda Morrison described a woman afraid for her life, but determined to protect her son. She recounted Bonnie's escape plans and that final, terrifying phone call. She said Michael threatened to kill her if she tried to take Aaron and leave. Linda testified through tears. She was scared but determined to get Aaron away before something terrible happened. The most anticipated testimony came on day 8, when 6-year-old Aaron took the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent as the small boy was led to the witness box, looking impossibly young in his dress shirt. "Aaron, do you know why you're here today?" Prosecutor Morrison asked gently. "To talk about Mommy," Aaron replied quietly. In heartbreaking simplicity, Aaron described waking to his parents arguing, sneaking to watch from the stairs. Mommy was crying. Daddy was yelling. He had the big gun. "What happened next, Aaron?" "There was a loud noise. Really, really loud. It hurt my ears. Mommy fell down, and she wasn't moving anymore." The courtroom was silent, except for muffled crying as Aaron described his father carrying his mother outside and burying her in the backyard. "I wanted to help Mommy wake up," Aaron said, his voice breaking. "But Daddy told me to go back inside. He said Mommy went away and wasn't coming back." Defense attorney Harrison tried to suggest Aaron's memories might be confused, but the boy's responses were consistent and detailed. When Harrison suggested it might have been a dream, Aaron looked at him with absolute certainty. "It wasn't a dream. Dreams don't hurt your ears like that. Dreams don't make your mommy stop moving." The prosecution revealed one final piece of evidence. 3 days before her murder, Bonnie had taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy with Aaron as beneficiary. She was trying to secure her son's future for when she left Michael. But Michael saw this as opportunity. If Bonnie died, he would control Aaron's inheritance. The money meant to protect her son became the motive for her murder. On October 25th, after deliberating less than 3 hours, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. November 15th, 1996. Sentencing day arrived with the same packed courtroom. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, citing premeditation and Michael's complete lack of remorse. But the defense made one compelling argument: executing Michael would orphan Aaron completely. Before announcing her decision, Judge Patricia Holt allowed victim impact statements. Elaine Clifton stood at the podium, hands shaking as she faced her daughter's killer. "Michael, you didn't just take my daughter's life," she said, voice steady despite her tears. "You stole 3 years of our lives while we searched for answers. You let us hope she might still be alive when you knew she was buried in our own backyard. But worst of all, you forced your own son to carry the burden of what you did. Aaron will have to live with these memories forever." John Clifton spoke next, anger barely contained. "Bonnie was trying to protect Aaron from you. She died trying to give him a better life. The only justice here is that Aaron will never have to live under your roof again." Judge Holt announced her decision. "Mr. Hyam, you have been convicted of first-degree murder of your wife, Bonnie Hyam. This was a calculated, cold-blooded killing to prevent your wife from leaving and to gain access to her life insurance money. However, considering the impact on your son Aaron, who has already lost his mother, I sentence you to life in prison without possibility of parole." Michael Hyam was led away in shackles, finally paying the price for his crimes. Aaron went to live permanently with his maternal grandparents, who surrounded him with love and counseling to help process his trauma. The insurance money that had cost his mother her life was placed in trust for Aaron's education. Bonnie's final gift would indeed secure his future, though not as she intended. The case became a landmark in forensic investigation and child testimony. It demonstrated the deadly reality of domestic violence and the remarkable resilience of young survivors. Detective Santos often thought about Aaron in the years that followed. "That little boy saved himself," she would tell other investigators. "He lived with his mother's killer for 3 years, played where she was buried, and found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most." Today, 28 years later, Aaron Hyam lives a private life, having used his mother's insurance money for college and a successful career. He rarely speaks publicly about the case that defined his childhood, but has become a quiet advocate for other children who witnessed domestic violence. Michael Hyam remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. He has never admitted guilt or expressed remorse, continuing to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The Bonnie Hyam case changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases involving domestic violence. It serves as a tragic reminder that victims often face deadly consequences when trying to escape abusive relationships. For Detective Santos, now retired, Bonnie's photo remained on her desk throughout her career, a reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deepest. "Every case matters," Santos tells young detectives, "but some change you forever. Bonnie's case taught me that justice will find a way. Sometimes it takes 3 years. Sometimes it takes a child's innocent words. But truth will always prevail." The case also revolutionized how investigators interview child witnesses, proving that even very young children can provide credible testimony when properly supported. For domestic violence advocates, Bonnie's story demonstrates both the incredible courage required to leave abusive relationships and the extraordinary resilience of survivors like Erin. The final question that haunts everyone who knows this story: what would you have done in Erin's position? Could you have carried such a devastating secret for 3 years? Could you have found the courage to speak when your words would send your father to prison for life? Erin Hyam did what few adults could do. He faced an unbearable truth, carried it with remarkable strength, and spoke with courage that solved a mystery and delivered justice for his mother. Bonnie Hyam's voice was silenced by violence on that cold January night in 1993. But her son's voice, clear, honest, and impossibly brave, ensured that she would never be forgotten and that her killer would never escape the consequences of his actions. The new bride who vanished without a trace became the victim who found justice through the most powerful witness of all, the child she died trying to protect. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth stronger than lies, and a mother's sacrifice was not in vain. Her son survived, thrived, and ensured that her story would serve as both a warning and an inspiration for generations to come. What started as a perfect Christmas morning in 1992 ended with perfect justice in 1996, delivered not by seasoned detectives or forensic experts, but by a 5-year-old boy who refused to let his mother's killer escape the truth.